Be me, Steven. Just a regular guy trying to navigate life. A few months back, I found myself in a familiar state of mind, the kind of dull exhaustion that only comes from scrolling through dating apps for too long. It felt like a part-time job where you never get paid, and the interviews are all terrible. Every profile started to blend into a single generic person holding a fish or standing on top of a mountain. I was on the verge of deleting the whole thing, taking a long break, and maybe just adopting a dog instead. It seemed like a much more straightforward path to companionship. But on what I told myself would be my last night of swiping, a profile popped up that broke through the monotony. Annie. The pictures were professional, almost too much so. One was her looking thoughtfully away from the camera in a coffee shop. Another was a candid-looking shot of her laughing at something out of frame. There was one of her at some kind of march or protest, holding a sign. The sign itself was cleverly obscured, so you couldn't quite read the slogan, but the energy was clear. It was the bio that really made me pause. It wasn't a list of hobbies or a funny quote. It was more like a list of non-negotiable terms and conditions. Socially conscious, politically aware, emotionally intelligent. Seeking a partner for radical growth and dismantling systemic structures. It ended with the line that should have been my cue to immediately swipe left. Don't waste my time if you're not ready to challenge your privilege. My thumb hovered over the screen. Every logical part of my brain was screaming at me to close the app. This had bad date story written all over it. But another part of me, the part that was tired and a little too optimistic, had a different thought. Maybe she was just passionate. Maybe the online persona was just a shield, and in person, she was actually down to earth. The pictures showed someone who was undeniably attractive, and curiosity got the better of me. I figured, what's the worst that can happen? I get a lecture, I pay for a drink, and I go home with a story. I swiped right. It was an instant match. A message from her appeared almost immediately. Hello? Just that. One word. I figured the ball was in my court. I sent a pretty standard opener, mentioning something about the coffee shop in her picture, and asking if she had any recommendations. Her reply took a few hours. It was just a prop for a photo shoot. Oh, okay then. The conversation continued like that for a couple of days. It was like trying to play tennis with someone who wouldn't hit the ball back. I'd ask questions, try to be engaging. She'd give short, declarative answers. There was no curiosity about me whatsoever. I wasn't being asked any questions about my life, my job, my interests. It felt less like a conversation and more like an initial screening. I suggested we meet up for a drink at a pretty cool, laid-back bar I knew. She immediately shut that down. She said she preferred somewhere quieter, a proper restaurant, where we could actually talk without shouting over music. She said a first date should be taken seriously, as it's an investment of her time and energy. A little intense, but I figured I could be flexible. I suggested a nice Italian place, not too fancy, not too casual, good food, quiet atmosphere. She agreed, but changed the day I proposed to one that was better for her schedule. Fine, no problem. So, we set the time and place. A Thursday evening, around 7:30. I made sure to get there about 10 minutes early. I've always thought being on time is a basic sign of respect. The restaurant was nice, just as I remembered. Low lighting, the smell of garlic and fresh bread in the air. I got a table and sat down, feeling reasonably optimistic. 7:30 came and went. I checked my phone, no messages. 7:40. I started to get that familiar, sinking feeling. The I'm about to get stood up feeling. I told myself I'd wait until 7:45 and then I'd just order dinner for myself. At 7:46, she walked in. She didn't hurry. She strolled in with an air of complete confidence, like she was the one who had been waiting. She scanned the room, spotted me, and walked over. There was no apology for being late. She sat down, placed her purse on the empty chair, and sighed dramatically. The traffic was an absolute nightmare, she announced. It wasn't an explanation, it was an accusation. It's just another example of how this city's infrastructure was designed by men, for men, with no consideration for how people actually live and commute. I was a bit taken aback. That was her opening line. I tried to keep it light. I said something like, "Well, I'm glad you made it." She just gave me a tight-lipped smile and picked up the menu. The waiter came over, a young guy who looked like he was probably in college. He asked if we wanted to start with some drinks. I ordered a beer. Annie held the menu up like a shield. studying the wine list with intense concentration. You would have thought she was deciphering an ancient text. After a long, silent moment, she looked up at the waiter. She asked him about the specific origin of one of the red wines. The poor kid was a bit flustered. He said he thought it was from California, but he could go check. She let out another sigh, this one laced with condescension. "Never mind," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "Just bring me a glass of the Malbec, and make sure it's at the proper temperature." The waiter nodded and scurried away. She put the menu down and fixed her gaze on me. "So," she began, her tone making it clear that the interview was about to start. "Tell me about yourself. What do you do to fill the empty hours of your day?" What a strange way to phrase that. I told her about some of my hobbies. I mentioned that I go to the gym regularly, that I enjoy hiking on the weekends, and that I sometimes just like to meet up with friends and watch a game. She listened with a look of clinical analysis on her face, nodding slowly. "The gym," she repeated, as if the words themselves had a bad taste. It's interesting how many men gravitate towards activities centered around physical exertion and body modification. She said it wasn't really a hobby, but more of a social performance of masculinity. She explained that it was a way for men to feel in control in a world where their traditional roles are becoming obsolete. I just wanted to say that I go to the gym to stay healthy and clear my head, but I was so blindsided I didn't say anything. She then moved on to my friends. She asked if my friend group was composed mostly of men. I said yeah, for the most part. She nodded again, that same knowing, slightly pitying nod. She told me that was a common problem. She said that all male friend groups create echo chambers of toxic behavior, reinforcing harmful stereotypes, and preventing men from developing any real emotional depth. The waiter returned with our drinks, and I've never been so happy to see a stranger in my life. He placed my beer in front of me and then presented her glass of wine. She picked it up, didn't even look at him, and swirled the contents in the glass. She took a tiny, delicate sip. Her face immediately contorted into a mask of displeasure. She looked up at the waiter, who was still standing there, and said, "This is not the proper temperature." He looked confused. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Is it too warm?" "It's tepid," she declared. "Red wine is meant to be served slightly below room temperature, not at the temperature of a heated swimming pool." The kid was clearly trying his best. "I can bring you a small bucket of ice if you'd like," he offered. Annie looked at him as if he had just suggested pouring ketchup on it. "No," she said sharply. "I am not going to put ice in my wine. That's barbaric. I want you to take this back, open a new bottle, and make sure that bottle has been properly stored. Bring me a new glass from that bottle." I just stared at my beer, feeling a wave of secondhand embarrassment. The kid, to his credit, just said, "Yes, ma'am," and took the glass away without another word. Annie watched him go, then turned back to me with a look of grim satisfaction. "You see, if you don't advocate for yourself, people will walk all over you. You have to demand the standard of treatment you deserve." She seemed to expect me to agree with her, to congratulate her on her little victory. I just took a long drink of my beer and said nothing. The silence hung in the air for a moment. She decided to break it by moving on to her next line of questioning. "What about your work?" she asked. I gave her a vague description of my field, not wanting to give her any more ammunition. I said it was technical and project-based. She latched onto that immediately. She asked if my workplace was diverse. She asked about the ratio of men to women in leadership positions. She wanted to know if the company had robust sensitivity training programs. I gave non-committal answers, but it didn't matter. She had already made up her mind. She told me that fields like mine are often the worst offenders when it comes to creating hostile environments for women. She said that the logical, unemotional nature of the work often attracts men who lack social skills and empathy. It was incredible. In the span of 15 minutes, she had diagnosed and condemned my hobbies, my friendships, and my career, all without knowing a single specific detail about any of them. The waiter came back with a new glass of wine. He presented it like it was a holy relic. "A new glass from a fresh bottle, ma'am." She took it, sipped it, and gave a single curt nod. He seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, and quickly left to take another table's order. "Much better," she said to me, as if the natural order of the universe had been restored. She then seemed to remember that a date is supposed to be a two-way street, at least in theory. "So, is there anything you'd like to ask me?" she offered, her tone suggesting it was a rare privilege. I was so mentally exhausted at this point that my mind was a blank. I grasped for the most neutral topic I could think of. "Seen any good movies lately?" I asked. She actually scoffed, a small, sharp, derisive sound. "I don't really watch movies," she said, making air quotes with her fingers. "The vast majority of mainstream cinema is just propaganda for the capitalist patriarchy. It's designed to numb the masses and reinforce the status quo." She said she preferred to consume media that was challenging and subversive. She started talking about some obscure documentary she had watched, a film that deconstructed the problematic nature of something I'd never even heard of. I just nodded along, my mind starting to drift. I was looking around the restaurant, at the other couples. They were laughing, talking, sharing plates of food. They looked like they were on actual dates. I felt a pang of jealousy. I was trapped in a lecture I hadn't signed up for. The waiter returned to take our food order. I quickly chose a steak. Simple, easy. Annie, of course, turned the ordering process into a full-scale negotiation. She had questions about every ingredient in the dish she was considering. Was the salmon wild-caught or farm-raised? Were the vegetables locally sourced and organic? Was the dressing on the side made with extra virgin olive oil? The waiter answered every question patiently. She finally decided on the most expensive fish dish on the menu, but with a list of substitutions and modifications. "And I'll have the dressing on the side, a very small amount." The waiter scribbled it all down and left, looking like he needed a stiff drink. Once he was gone, she turned her attention back to me. Her eyes scanned my simple, boring plate choice. "Steak," she said, shaking her head slowly. "Of course." I knew what was coming. She launched into a monologue about the symbolic link between red meat consumption and aggressive male behavior. She talked about the environmental impact of the cattle industry, the ethics of factory farming, and how my food choice was a direct contribution to multiple global crises. By the time our food arrived, I had lost most of my appetite. The waiter set our plates down. My steak looked delicious, perfectly cooked. Her modified fish dish looked exactly as she had ordered it. I was hoping the arrival of food might signal a ceasefire, a chance to just eat in peace for a few minutes. That hope was short-lived. She looked at my plate, then at her own, and said something that completely baffled me. "It's only fair that you're paying, you know." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. I hadn't even thought about the bill yet. Usually it's something you figure out at the end of the meal. I must have had a confused look on my face, she elaborated. "Considering the systemic economic imbalances and the historical wage gap, a man paying for the first date is the bare minimum. It's not chivalry, it's a small act of economic reparations." I just stared at her. She wasn't joking, she was deadly serious. The food sat on our plates, getting cold. The entire evening had been a series of tests, and I had apparently failed all of them. My hobbies were a performance of masculinity. My friends were an echo chamber of toxicity. My job was a pillar of the patriarchy. My food choice was destroying the planet. And now, my financial obligation was to pay for the privilege of being told all of this. It was at that moment that I tried to salvage the evening, one last time. I decided to ignore her comment about the bill and change the subject to something deeply personal, something that couldn't possibly be twisted into a political statement. I was wrong, so wrong. I decided to tell her about my father. I took a deep breath, trying to push past the wall of criticism she had built between us. I thought that maybe, just maybe, if I shared something genuine, something from the heart, it might break through her ideological armor. "You know," I started, cutting into my steak. "Speaking of things men do, it reminds me of something." She raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, her fork hovering over her fish. "Go on." I started telling her about my dad. He's an old-school kind of guy, not a man of many words. He shows his love through actions, not speeches. For my entire life, that's how we've communicated. A few weeks ago, I went over to my parents' house for the weekend. In the garage, sitting under a dusty tarp, was the old car he'd had since before I was born. It was a classic, a real piece of work, but it hadn't run in at least a decade. It was his pride and joy back in the day. He used to take me for drives in it when I was a little kid. On that Saturday morning, he pulled the tarp off and just stood there, looking at it. He told me he was thinking of finally getting it running again. I could see the spark in his eye. So I spent the entire weekend in that garage with him. I don't know a lot about cars, not like he does. But he taught me, patiently. He showed me how to clean the engine parts, how to check the wiring, how to tell what needed replacing. We didn't talk much about deep emotional stuff. We talked about torque wrenches and spark plugs. We got grease on our hands and clothes. We drank cheap coffee and listened to an old radio playing classic rock. And for the first time in a long time, I felt completely connected to him. It was like the car was a bridge between our two generations. We were just two guys, working on a project together, side by side. It was simple. It was real. I was in the middle of explaining how it felt when he finally turned the key and the engine sputtered back to life after all those years. I was trying to convey the look on his face, that rare, unfiltered smile of pure satisfaction. I was trying to explain that this was more than just fixing a machine. It was about legacy, about a father passing something down to his son, even if it was just a little bit of know-how. I didn't get to finish. Annie put her fork down with a loud clink against the plate. The sound cut right through my story. "I'm going to stop you right there," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any warmth or empathy. It was the voice of a surgeon about to make an incision. I stopped, confused. "What you're describing," she began, leaning forward as if to deliver a verdict, "is a textbook example of how patriarchal norms are passed down." I just blinked. "You see," she continued, her condescending tone back in full force, "your story isn't about family bonding. It's about the perpetuation of harmful gender roles." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The garage is a traditionally male space. The car, a symbol of male freedom and power. The physical labor, a way for men to validate their masculinity without ever having to engage in vulnerable emotional communication. She wasn't just interpreting my story. She was dissecting it, stripping it of all personal meaning and replacing it with her own rigid, cynical framework. "Your father wasn't teaching you how to fix a car," she declared with absolute certainty. "He was teaching you how to be a man in the most restrictive and toxic sense of the word. He was teaching you that a man's worth is tied to his utility, his ability to fix things, rather than his capacity for emotional expression." I was speechless. This wasn't a conversation. It was a violation. She had taken a cherished memory, a rare and beautiful moment with my father, and twisted it into something ugly. She had called it toxic. She had called my father's way of showing love a harmful stereotype. She hadn't heard a story about a son connecting with his dad. She had only heard the evidence she was looking for to confirm her worldview. A worldview in which everything I was, everything I came from, was fundamentally flawed. And that was it. That was the moment something inside me just switched off. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was a profound, chilling clarity. I realized that there was absolutely nothing I could say or do to change her perception. I could argue, I could defend my father, I could try to explain the nuance and the emotion she was missing. But it would be pointless. It would be like arguing with a brick wall, a very articulate, condescending brick wall. Any defense I offered would just be labeled male fragility or defensiveness. I would be proving her point in her eyes. I had walked into this date hoping for a connection, or, at the very least, a pleasant evening. Instead, I had been subjected to a grueling ideological purity test. She wasn't interested in getting to know Stephen, the person. She was interested in diagnosing the problems of man, the category, and I was just the specimen on her examination table. I looked down at my plate. The steak was half-eaten. Her expensive fish was barely touched. The whole scene felt absurd. We were two strangers, sitting in a nice restaurant, surrounded by the warm buzz of other people's happy evenings, and we were a million miles apart. I realized that continuing to sit there would be an act of disrespect to myself. It would be an admission that this was acceptable, that it was okay for someone to tear down my life, my family, and my identity, all for the price of a meal. My earlier frustration melted away and was replaced by a quiet resolve. I wasn't going to fight. I wasn't going to argue. I was just going to leave. I slowly, deliberately placed my knife and fork down on the plate. I didn't slam them. I didn't make a scene. I just put them down. Annie was still talking, blissfully unaware of the shift that had just occurred in me. She was now explaining how my nostalgia for that moment in the garage was a symptom of patriarchal melancholy, a longing for a bygone era of male dominance. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my wallet. I opened it, took out enough cash to cover my steak, my beer, and a very generous tip for the waiter, who had endured her behavior all night. I didn't want him to be shortchanged because of her. I placed the bills neatly on the table, next to my plate, weighing them down with my water glass. Annie finally trailed off, noticing my movements, her brow furrowed. "What are you doing?" she asked, a note of confusion in her voice. I pushed my chair back from the table. The sound of the legs scraping slightly on the wooden floor seemed incredibly loud in that moment. I stood up. She stared up at me, her mouth slightly open. The condescending smirk was gone, replaced by genuine bewilderment. It was clear she had no idea what was happening. In her world, she was the one in control of the interaction. She was the one who decided when it was over. "Are you going to the restroom?" she asked, as if that was the only logical explanation. I looked down at her, not with anger or spite, but just with a kind of finality. I didn't look her in the eyes. I looked at the spot on the wall just over her shoulder. "No," I said. My voice was calm and even. "I'm leaving." I turned and started walking away from the table. "Wait," she called out, her voice suddenly sharp, a mix of shock and indignation. "What are you talking about? You can't just leave." A few people at the nearby tables turned to look. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking towards the exit. "We haven't even finished our meal," she yelled, her voice rising in pitch. "The bill! You didn't pay the bill." I heard her chair scrape as she half stood up. I didn't break my stride. I reached the heavy wooden door of the restaurant, pushed it open, and stepped out into the cool night air. The door swung shut behind me, cutting off her voice. The sounds of the restaurant were replaced by the sounds of the city. Traffic, distant sirens, people talking as they walked past. I took a deep breath. It felt like I had been holding it for the entire evening. I felt a profound sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off my chest. I hadn't won an argument. I hadn't owned her with a clever comeback. I had simply refused to continue playing a game that was rigged against me from the start. I had valued my own peace of mind and self-respect more than I valued the opinion of a complete stranger. I walked down the street for a block, then paused. Out of a morbid sense of curiosity, I glanced back at the restaurant. Through the large front window, I could see our table. I could see Annie. She was standing now, gesturing wildly at the waiter who had approached her. I could see her pointing at my empty chair, then at the bill in his hand. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The calm, intellectually superior facade had completely crumbled. She was no longer a calm social critic deconstructing the patriarchy. She was just a woman, left alone at a table with a bill she had fully expected someone else to pay. The waiter seemed to be pointing at the cash I had left on the table. He was probably explaining that I had paid for my share. Her frantic gesturing stopped. She seemed to shrink a little. She slowly sat back down in her chair. The other diners were now openly staring at her. She, who had spent the entire evening judging everyone and everything around her, was now the object of judgment herself. The public humiliation she had tried to subtly inflict on me all night had boomeranged back onto her in the most direct way possible. I couldn't hear what was happening, but I could see the final act play out. She reached into her expensive purse, pulled out her own wallet, and slapped her credit card down on the table with a defeated finality. I turned away and kept walking. I didn't feel triumphant or vengeful. I just felt free. I had walked into that date feeling tired of the whole dating scene, and I walked out of it with a renewed sense of clarity. I wasn't avoiding commitment. I was avoiding mistreatment. I wasn't afraid of strong women. I was unwilling to tolerate disrespectful people. The problem wasn't that I needed to challenge my privilege. The problem was that she didn't see me as a person at all. I was just a symbol, a representative of a group she despised. I got to the corner, hailed a cab, and went home. Later that night, I opened the dating app one last time. I had one new message. It was from her. It was a long, rambling paragraph filled with insults and accusations. She called me a coward. She called me a fragile child. She accused me of being intimidated by a strong, intelligent woman. She wrote that my behavior was typical and proved every single point she had been making. I read the first few lines, and then I stopped. I didn't feel the need to read the rest. Her words had no power over me anymore. I simply blocked her profile. And then, with a feeling of immense satisfaction, I pressed the button I had been meaning to press for weeks. I deleted my account, and I went to bed and had the best night's sleep I'd had in a long, long time.